Today, I am beyond excited to welcome Marianne Cherry to the show. Marianne is an LA-based writer, former network TV producer, and the author of the definitive biography, Morris Kight, Humanist, Liberationist, Fantabulist, a story of gay rights and gay wrongs. She didn't just research Morris Kight, she actually befriended the legendary activist in the last decade of his life, got his personal blessing to tell his story, and spent years capturing the unfiltered truth about one of the most colorful, controversial, and consequential figures in the American gay rights movement. From his wild Texas childhood at a brothel to co-founding the LA Gay Liberation Front, building the Gay Community Services Center, and turning street theater into a weapon against oppression, Morris Kight was a true force of nature. Marianne, thank you so much for joining us. We're about to download one hell of a story.
Thanks, Duke. It's nice to be here with you.
Thank you. You actually became friends with Morris Kight in the final years of his life and wrote this book with his explicit permission. What was it like earning the trust of such a larger-than-life figure? And what surprised you most when you started digging in to his personal archives and memories?
Well, knowing Morris for the last 10 years of his life, and I didn't realize he was a larger-than-life figure, even though I had heard about him before I met him. I moved to Venice, California in the late 70s, and I always heard about this old man who had a house where he would have yard sales, and if you knew that he also had a doctor in the back room who would treat you for STDs. Because in those nasty old days, if you had a sexually transmitted disease, you were immediately reported to the Board of Health. Often your name ended up in the newspaper. Your spouse was informed, your employer, everybody. I mean, it was just, and so Morris saw that as a public health crisis, which it was. So he got doctors. He got legitimate doctors to work off the books and treat people in the back room, and they got the medications somehow. So I'd heard about this man, and then when I had the opportunity to meet him, I thought, oh, wow, this is the guy. I'm putting together all the dots. And he was lovely. He was just a regular, lovely, older man with a lot of stories to tell. And I became his ride, amongst many other people. We become the ride to take him to an event or to go shopping. And we would always have lunch at the French Market on Santa Monica Boulevard. He loved to go there because he loved to be seen. And there was one thing I knew about Morris is he was not shy, but he read people really well. He was very astute in how he observed people. And I knew under the hood that there was a story there. There was a bigger story than even he was telling, because there were certain gaps in his history, as he would talk about being in New Mexico during the 50s, and then suddenly he'd leap ahead and he's in Los Angeles in the 60s. So I think what surprised me the most, and this is true for any of us, anybody who's going to live 83 years, our lives don't happen in a linear way. They go up and down. And some of his peaks and valleys, I think, stunned me. And I figured out that he was married in the 50s, which I knew from him. He had 2 daughters, but I never knew the circumstances of how that broke up. And it wasn't really until I went to Texas. I had to travel to Texas 3 times to meet with his former wife, the lovely Stanley Beth. Now, she was very willing and happy to tell me her whole story, except that she'd had a stroke right before I visited her for the first time. And her mind was still very acute, but she did not have, her speech abilities were belabored. So that's why I had to go back 2 more times to make sure that I got the story correctly. Now, mind you, now she's 80 years old when I'm talking to her. The last time I saw her, she was 83. And I'm probably ripping open the wound, one of her most painful wounds of her life, in her 20s, because she was very naive when she married him. And she came from a moneyed family in New Mexico, and they had connections, and they were very happy to start grooming Morris for a shot at governor of New Mexico. Wow. And what struck me was the harshness of the times that they lived through. And at that point, looking back, I can say, well, he was kind of cold, but he was cold in a cold world is really how I view it now. And there was a big scandal. And because she came from a family with a big name, the scandal was even bigger. And she was so naive. She had no idea. And he had been living a double life the whole time.
It's fascinating. Out of curiosity, I could talk about this stuff for hours, but out of curiosity, when did you start writing the book? How long did the process go on where you first start? I know you were friends with him, but then
Right.
when did you, how long into the friendship did you start working on a book and meeting his ex-wife? And
I was first offered to do a oral history with him. So this came about in like maybe September, October of 2002. And I said, no, I don't want to, because he will turn it into a 200-page press release, because that's where Morris was at. And so the day before he died, he called me and we talked about me doing a legitimate biography of him. And he talked about some of the papers that were lost and where some of them was sent to UCLA and one archives at USC. And he told me about papers that he had sent to a nascent archive back east, and he never heard from them again. I'm so sorry, Marianne. I said, don't worry about it, Morris. I did end up finding those papers. But in that conversation, that last conversation with him, he had no idea how far I was going to dive. I didn't know either myself at that time. I knew I had to go to New Mexico, which was my first stop. So he passed away, I think, in January of 2003. I was in New Mexico probably in May or June. Wow. And so I knew when I got there, I had some dirt under my fingernails digging around. And I knew I had to meet Stan LaBeouf. It just was that whole story wasn't going to make sense to me. His youngest daughter, Carol, was very supportive. She really wanted to see this. She loved her father, even though, looking back, he abandoned that family, probably out of need, but he had to walk away. So then it took me another couple of years. It took me over 10 years to finish it, because I would do a whole bunch of writing, then I'd have to step away and do some of my own work. And then I'd do some more. And then in that time, my mother was passing away. So there was a lot of things going on. And also, I wanted to make sure that I dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, because I know this community, and and I was told they're going to go over this with a fine-tooth comb, Marianne. You better know your stuff. So I was prepared for my finals.
No, I mean, it is such an unbelievably, not just in terms of how, he lived to even though he passed away now, 23 years ago, he lived till a quite advanced age. I mean, he had a very full, very, prolonged life. But in terms of figuring out like really what was at the core of this man, I wanted to bring up the fact that, he began his life in the 1930s in a Texas brothel where, as a teenager, he secretly helped the women there get medical care and escape violence in the 1930s. So he already had, from a young age, a very strong sense of like moral righteousness. And where do you think those early experiences, or how do you think they forged the fearless and justice-obsessed activist that he became?
I think Morris was a voracious reader. He always was, his entire life. But growing up in this small town in Texas, his access. There's only so many times you can read Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. And so he started sending away to the one of the libraries in Chicago he got a hold of, and they started sending him material. And he'd have to write a book report and send it back. And then they would send him more books and comments on his previous book report. And I think he was mostly self-educated. Of course, he did, end up going to the Texas Christian University, and then later Austin, the University of Austin. But Morris is from a very young life. Now, this is where Morris and I really had in common. His father died when he was 7. Mine died when I was 10. So we could compare those notes. And his mother was absolutely horrified. She was frozen when he died, when her husband died. And that's really where her attentions were on her husband. His older sister and his older brother soon left home. So it was Morris and his mother fending for themselves through the Depression. And she was a hustler. once she emerged from her grief, she was a full-on hustler, bootlegger, and she ran a little brothel. They bought a motel in the, I guess they call it the red light district out of Fort Worth. And Morris helped around the grounds, and he also would sometimes help in the kitchen if need be. And that's where he got to know these young women who were prostitutes. And he got a car. He was like 14, 15 years old, and he was driving an old jalopy. He found out about a place in, I think it was Tennessee, and he would drive them to Tennessee to be treated and then bring them back. Now, when Morris is telling of the story, he never mentions his mother being the madam of these women. I got that from his former wife and his daughter, because they knew more of his family. So it was like the two of them were really a little bit like Paper Moon, that movie with Ryan O'Neal. They were like, yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's very cinematic. I mean, I can totally. I mean, hopefully. I mean, I know the reason we connected was because there's going to be a documentary about Morris, which I was honored to participate in, and I know it's the genesis of that was your book, and so I'm very excited to see it on the screen. And who knows, maybe it'll even turn into a movie at some point.
Exactly. The story is there. The story
it really is.
Yes.
I mean, no one exemplifies larger than life more than Morris. I mean, for real, the guy was unbelievable. I mean, speaking of like jumping, because there is so much we could talk about in terms of his life, but 1969, which was really, the moment in history where both on the East and West Coast, the gay rights movement really converged on both coasts, in LA, in New York City. And he helped launch the LA chapter of the Gay Liberation Front here in LA, and later co-founded the Gay Community Services Center, which we now know of today as the LA LGBT Center, which is, I think the LA LGBT Center might be the largest gay nonprofit in the world, I think. Maybe, certainly in America, but I think it might even be in the world. I mean, that in and of itself is an unbelievable achievement and an unbelievable legacy. I wanted to ask you, in terms of, I mean, there's so much that he did, but what were some of the most bold and most theatrical tactics that Morris used that actually moved the needle on gay rights in LA, in a city that was still deeply hostile back in the 1960s?
Well, going back to the center for a minute, which I think it definitely was the first of its kind, a service center, a community services center by and for gay people. Because you couldn't get any psychiatrist to come in and treat a gay person holistically. So they would have peer counseling. But that started even before there was a sign that said Gay Community Services Center. I think one of the bolder things that Morris did, I talked about the backroom STD treatment. He also had an underground bail fund. He would put his phone number on walls in bars and on the prison walls if you need help, if you need counseling, because he knew that the only way to build a community was one individual at a time. And he was up against the Los Angeles Police Department that also knew the way to destroy a community was one individual at a time. So the arrests for entrapment and solicitation were just off the charts. And he had attorneys who would help you get out of those charges. He also had ways to find you employment. So one of his bolder tactics, and I know people like to do a broader sweep, saying we'll just bring all these people together and have them do it. Morris was one-on-one, one person at a time, and then you take what you learn and you bring it to the next person. And he had a collective in the house that he lived on 4th Street, and then later on McCadden Place in Hollywood, and nobody slept outside. Everybody had a place to sleep if you knew Morris Kight. So I think that was definitely one of his bolder moves. Now, he was not an above-ground gay rights activist until 1969, when Stonewall happened. So the post-Stonewall movement, as we call it, was the opening door for Morris. Prior to that, he was very well known, and he laid a lot of groundwork in the anti-war movement. He founded what was known as the Dow Action Committee, which was the first successful corporate boycott in America. And it boycotted the Dow Chemical Company, really just one product, which was brilliant, rather than trying to say, don't buy any Dow products. No, they just focused on their most successful product, Saran Wrap, because that's what was funding the creation of napalm to be used in Vietnam. It was enormously successful to the degree that President Nixon then ordered a white paper on how did this happen? Why is it so successful? And how can we prevent this from happening now? And it became known as the Lewis Powell Doctrine. You can still find it online. And it is really the blueprint for what we're living through today. They laid the groundwork, the work was done, and now we have this. But as far as the gay rights, again, going back to his individual movement, he started the Gay Liberation Front, co-founded it, I should say, with Don Kilhefner and a few other people. And they took a vote, amongst all the people that were there, what's your first focus? And they almost unanimously voted was to take down the faggots stay out sign from the Barney's Beanery in West Hollywood. And that turned into, I think, 2-month boycott. They did a sit-in. It was a lot of fun. It looks like a lot of fun anyway. And Morris, for the rest of his life, he had that sign hanging over his sofa like a trophy prize. So there was he had a lot of isms, and he would tell people, don't just do something, stand there. And he wanted you to own your place in the world as a gay person. And he knew walking down the street holding hands, that was a sign of revolution. And he also, when he first came to California and he met the Harry Hay and the Mattachine Society, now those guys were still meeting behind drawn curtains and locked doors and talking about gay marriage. And he said, this is silly. You can't even walk down the street. You're not going to get married. So he timed it. He knew the timing. He was a great strategist. And I think that's what he contributed to the gay movement, not just on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, across the board, because he definitely was in daily communication with East Coast activists.
Wow. No, without a doubt, his effect and his impact was made around the country. I thought it was interesting and amusing that the book calls him a humanist, liberationist, and a fantabulist. Break those down for us. How did those three sides of his personality clash? And they fueled each other too, and ultimately made him such an effective activist and organizer.
Well, he was a humanist for sure, from through and through. He couldn't identify with, he would show up for, Troy Perry with MCC Church, invited him in time. He was always very respectful and showed up. But Morris was a humanist. He took the human, the holistic side of the human, and that's where he, I don't want to say he prayed, because he didn't really pray, but that's what he believed in, is in the betterment of the human. A liberationist, I think we have a whole generation, took 2 generations of people to speak to how he liberated people. Mm-hmm. And then there is the fantabulist, and that goes into the people who liked Morris absolutely loved him, and the people who didn't like Morris abhorred him. I would sometimes come across somebody and I was like, whoa, you got to calm down. Because he would barrel over things. And so part of the fantabulist is there was always a little bit of bullshit in his spiel, but he's also building it up, making it as fantastic as possible to get you excited.
It's true. Okay, I'm not making a comparison between the two at all. But on the other side of the aisle, or the other, you might say that we've seen what being a fantabulist, in a sense, granted with very different goals and very different, but being, I think, maybe without referencing Donald Trump, I'll use the example of, for instance, other gay activists like Larry Kramer, who, I remember reading about him and reading that, some of the things he said were not necessarily always true, or even if they were to lie, they were maybe an exaggeration, or he expressed them in an over-the-top way to either garner attention for the cause or to build a case. There was always an underlying principle, of course, and an underlying motivation for good. But I do think that also is as we've learned, for better or for worse. But in terms of Morris, we being a fantabulist and being a good showman and knowing how to put on a good show, in a way, is an important part of building a political movement. And I think our side of the aisle, or our whether it be the gay rights movement or other civil rights movements, that's an important lesson that I think we sometimes we need to remember, that for better or worse, theatrics and knowing how to garner and galvanize people and attention is an important component.
Yes, sales. Really important. And you got to sell people their own liberation. He saw that. And I see it in a lot of that I did, way back. Out of the older gay people, they felt safe in their closets. They knew what was in there. They knew what to expect. And so when Morris was like throwing the closet doors open with the first gay pride parade, the first legal gay pride parade, the fact that he got a permit for that on Hollywood Boulevard in 1970, and that was to celebrate the anniversary of Stonewall, that was huge. I mean, I can't express that enough. And yes, there was some fantabulist put into it. And you had to convince people to show up for themselves. And he knew that. And also because he knew that gay people had been so royally screwed over in every way. It just takes one little arrest and you can lose your job, your family, your home, everything. And it could be an entrapment even. And that didn't matter to anybody else.
No, absolutely. You kind of referenced this earlier, but I think it's so important because I think these days people don't necessarily think about things or coalition building politics this way that often anymore. Everybody's so siloed. But Morris had connections, and came out of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, before he turned his full energy to gay liberation. You mentioned that, but
yes.
How do you think those earlier fights shaped his understanding of coalition building and why he believed that gay people had to be out loud and visible and unapologetic?
Yeah, but he never wanted to force anyone to do anything before they were ready for it. There was strength in numbers, and he never wanted you to out yourself at work if it wasn't safe, if it was going to cost you the job or even your health. So there was timing, and I think by the early 80s, by the time AIDS was really heating up, there was the whole community was forced to coalesce behind themselves and to be strong in who they were. AIDS was a double-edged sword for sure. And, but yes, coalition building was very important to Morris because, and he got a lot of straight people to come on board. He got Wallace Albertson and her husband, Jack Albertson, the actor. They were the first hetero couple to appear in the gay parade. So that was a big deal. And he got straight Councilwoman Peggy Stevenson. She was definitely for gay rights, but she just didn't know what to do. And so Morris led her along. Said, here, we need this passed. Can you support this? And whether it passed or not, her support meant everything.
The term intersectionality is something that we heard so often, whether it be watching or reading your book, watching documentaries about Harvey Milk, or or the film Milk, which showed him the clash between with the whole Prop 6 battle, the people who felt that we should they're the people that said we should work with the straight politicians. We should work with the civil African Americans, with the Chicano movement. But there were, in other words, there were so many different people with different ideas about what the most effective way to achieve change is. And Morris had to deal with, all sorts of different people, betrayals, ego clashes, gay wrongs inside the movement itself. And so what would you say the hardest internal lessons from his story that modern activists still need to hear?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
I know.
Yeah, I think Morris was a bit of an enigma in that he was all about community, but he also liked to be alone. He worked best solo. He really, like, joined Briggs, I think, is a good example, because there were different pockets of the Briggs Initiative. And Morris was kind of a solo player with that. He would definitely cross paths with Harvey Milk and everyone else. And they would call him and say, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. And he'd say, well, we're going to, march up. I'm going with Steve Berman. And he's the guy that walked up the California and raised consciousness and raised funds for Briggs. So I think what we have to remember is that this can be very lonely work. And you also have to be fearless in standing up for what you truly believe. And sometimes you're going to be the only voice in the room saying, no, that's white. That's it, and everybody else saying, no, it's black. And you say, but I see it as white. And so it can be very lonely. And Morris didn't mind that. He could, and he knew so many people that you just walk around the corner with him, and you're gonna. Walking down the street with Morris was like being with the mayor. Hello.
He was. I mean, they say Harvey Milk was the mayor of Castro Street. I think you could argue that Morris Kight was the mayor of gay LA. I mean, that's actually they both were probably the two most influential gay rights leaders in California back then, certainly.
Yes. And they had, the thing that they had most in common is they were not afraid of their enemies. And Morris would always, be very respectful with Chief Davis, the chief of police, and then Daryl Gates. They were awful people. They were terrible to the gay community, but Morris would always show up and say, this is what we need, and this is why we need it, and thank you very much. And so he was able to make strides to the point that Daryl Gates even called him at the end when he was leaving office and thanked him for working with him. So it was
Daryl Gates who left office, arguably, well, not arguably, left office in this cloud of what. Wasn't he police chief during the Rodney King riots? Was that Daryl Gates? Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Oh, he was awful. Yeah. He was like, so at least now we know his target wasn't just the gay community.
Right.
It was everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, for me, that's a perfect example, coming back to that whole topic of intersectionality. And look, I'm as big of a Democrat and, gay, long-time self-proclaimed gay rights activist, just seems a little highfalutin, but, I do think about, I feel very strongly and very principled about these topics. Having said that, I do think part of that anecdote right there about Morris working with Daryl Gates, who was, one of the most conservative, bigoted, police chiefs in LA history, I think sometimes, because we believe so strongly in these principles, not just in the gay rights movement, in the progressive sort of movement in general, political movement, I think sometimes people can be a little bit wary of the notion that sometimes you have to work with people that you don't necessarily agree with, and that somehow working with people, even if you really don't like them, and even if you have really strong differences, that somehow makes you morally compromised in some way. And I think that's been a big sort of clash in the progressive movement this last decade, is you've got the people who believe in, if you even talk to the other side, or you even, compromise even a little bit in order to get, to achieve your main goal, that somehow makes you a traitor, or means that, and those sorts of clashes have always been there. I mean, I know, watching The Normal Heart with Larry Kramer, how do you even work with Ed Koch? Because, he's a closeted gay man, and, and his administration has been silent. So, there's always been this sort of clash between the people that are like, you can't even talk to the other side because then you're a traitor. And then the people who are like, you know what? We may have differences, not just the other side, but even within our own, with the black leaders or the Latino leaders, there's always going to be differences and divides that need to be crossed. But sometimes you have to talk to people you disagree with in order to achieve your goals.
Absolutely. And Morris knew that. This purity test that we put people through today is just, it's so destructive.
No.
And it's inhuman. It's
And it's arbitrary too, because
Very.
not to get into the weeds, but like, okay, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things I love about Bernie Sanders, but with Hillary Clinton, I was a big Hillary supporter back in 2016, and I was just like, so of course nobody's perfect. Like, sure, where there are things, that she could have been better at or whatever, but this notion, first of all the people that, okay, now I'm really getting off topic, but like people that were like, they were criticizing Hillary for, speaking at Goldman Sachs or whatever. I'm like, wait a second. Bernie Sanders, who I love and respect in a lot of ways, by the way. Bernie Sanders voted with the NRA for 10 years, when he was, because he was, I know this is really off topic, but to the point that I don't understand where all these people that came up with these litmus tests or purity tests about, Hillary Clinton not being sufficiently progressive. I'm like, this woman, has spent her whole life, fighting for feminism, for gay rights. In other words, this notion that who gets to decide who is a true progressive or a true, principled activist or to me, as long as you're on the team towards trying to get to the eventual goal of a better, more righteous society, then, even if we don't see eye to eye on everything, to me, that's good enough. If somebody's
yes, you're
if somebody's
right.
willing to work with
Work
you,
with who you can work with, and then you work with who you have to work with. And I think, speaking of the Clintons, I think a good example it would be Bill Clinton's "Don't Ask, Don't Tell."
Right.
Now, this was big. It was very big disappointment when he did that. And now, mind you, Morris didn't want any gays in the military. He didn't want anybody in the military. Morris came out of a school of thought where he thought all gays were pacifists. Well, he got a rude awakening.
Well,
So-
that's a perfect example right there. People are saying Bill Clinton wasn't liberal enough on "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." Morris was saying, he was even to the left of those people saying that we shouldn't even. So it just shows there's so many different factions.
But Morris set my wagon straight with that. We had to talk about it, and he said, well, the problem is expectations. Did you have the expectation that he was going to allow openly gays in the military at this time? And he rationalized that it was a step towards where they wanted to be, which turns out to be true. So he understood they're little steps, little increments. And we're going to have to go through a lot of this again in different areas. It's the people who didn't like Morris was mostly because Morris would shake the hands of the other people they didn't like. Mm-hmm. We're not getting anywhere with that.
Mm-mm. No, if you want to achieve, I think that there's truth to the idea. There's proof. Whether it be, not to bring him up again, but Larry Kramer, Morris Kight, almost all of the most successful activists in the history of politics really had enemies and had people that said they either sold out or they were gadflies or curmudgeons or that's just, if you're actually going to achieve something, you're always going to piss some people off, and that's just otherwise you can sit there and just try not to offend anybody, but ultimately that's not going to achieve anything or get you anywhere.
You have to offend people. You have to be willing to offend people. And then if you are like Morris Kight, you can be polite enough where you'll offend them and then they immediately forgive you because they see your point. And it's not about going personal. It's about being a principle.
Right.
And I think he understood that. But when he questioned, like, what were your expectations? And that's the only reason why we really get disappointed is when our expectations are out of balance.
Right. That's why, you hear, and then I'll move on to the next question, but it's true, like, this whole debate of incrementalism and how sometimes, people are like, that's not good enough. We got to go all the way. And it's always been, for what my opinion's worth, for what it's worth, I've always believed, not that we shouldn't have big aspirations, but that ultimately, the only way you're going to actually make a difference is by being okay with making these steps towards, look, gay marriage, it took 20 years, basically, or no, maybe not. 93 to 2015. That was about when the first Hawaii case, I think, was It was before the
Longer than 93. It's
longer, right? Well, Baker v. Nelson back in the 70s. Right. I mean, so it was a long journey, and you got to be okay with that. Sometimes that even though we wanted gay marriage 40 years ago, it took it took a while to get there.
You have to be comfortable. And I'm at the age now where I'm seeing this, where I have to be comfortable with the idea of planting seeds for a tree of which I will never enjoy. I will never enjoy the shade, but that's okay. As long as that tree will come up someday.
Absolutely.
And Morris knew that. And, you know, he never stopped working right up to his last day. He never stopped making phone calls on behalf of what needed to be done and addressed. And that was him.
I guess there were two final questions, but I guess I could sort of wrap them both into one. One of Morris's biggest achievements, and one that I always really looked to closely, is sort of a roadmap, because I was involved. I was one of the leaders of the Beverly Hills Hotel boycott and the Dorchester collection when they passed Sharia law in Brunei, and this was 12 years ago now, but I was involved. I worked with Cleve Jones on the boycott, and I looked to the example of the Coors Beer boycott with Morris Kight and with Harvey Milk and a lot of other prominent gay rights leaders at the time and labor leaders. But what would you say on that specifically, on the Coors boycott, but also sort of more broadly? What would you say are some of the big lessons that we can take away in terms of tools that activists can use now as a means of fighting this administration and this authoritarian movement that we're seeing around the country? So I would say sort of more specifically in terms of the boycott, but then more broadly just from his life and his work during his lifetime.
Well, I think what we can learn from the Coors boycott, and this is where Morris became very unpopular. Coors was it, and probably still is, an awful company, not just to gays, but to women, to any minorities. They have different levels of pay, and they're just terrible. But they started throwing money at the gay pride parade at West Hollywood, big money. And so now in the early 80s, mid 80s, there was a lot of money in the gay community. And a lot of that was because of AIDS. It was being distributed in different ways, but it was also because there were a lot of double income, no children households. So it's the same thing that we're going to have to face here. It's the lure of money. And it's not just the power of money. It is the comfort of money. And so they were arguing with Morris, saying, but they want to give us all this money and we can do this with it and that with it. And Morris said, there's a price tag on that. And he felt that the gay community was being used and abused by the Coors Corporation and the Coors family specifically. And they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it. So I think the risks that we have is there's always going to be differences of opinions in rooms. I go to a lot of meetings. I'm on Zoom a lot. And we have to be able to listen to someone that we don't agree with and try to communicate in a much more open and honest way. We're not going to always get what we want, but if we can at least stay on the path of liberation, then we're going to be on the winning side. And the Coors thing was upsetting. It was, and I saw how they treated him was terrible. There was a lot of disrespect, not just because he was an elder of the community, but because he was an elder. He was an older. You just don't talk to old people like that, I think to myself. Mm-hmm. And Nancy was involved with that as well. And it was complicated. It could be very complicated, but it all comes down to one thing. It's about money. We need money, but we can't disabuse ourselves for it.
Absolutely. No, I think that's why I wanted to talk to you, was not only did I enjoy getting to meet you and being honored, honestly, to be part of the documentary, but when you gave me a copy of the book, and I've been reading it and really enjoying it, I already had a good base of information about Morris's life, but it occurred to me that I can't think of a more timely and more important subject to discuss, not just Morris and the lessons that he left behind for our generation, for the next generation, But I think, if I, as I said in the interview for the documentary, I so wish he were still with us, and the people like, we need people like that more than ever. But at least we have you and this incredible book as a way of memorializing that information and that legacy. And I encourage everybody to take a look at it. Will you have the link so people can buy it in the caption of this video?
You know what? I'm going to put up the Feral House link and Amazon. And that's the best places to get it for now. And then we'll have more going down the road. And you can also go to my website. We'll have www.morriskight.com and also mariannecherrywriter.com will be a good place to get the book as well. I hope you all stay in touch.
Absolutely. And, I look forward to seeing it in person, but I saw the photos online of the tribute or the memorial to Morris that they put up at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And I saw Maxine Waters was there. Was that right?
She showed up. She was there on a Saturday afternoon by herself, no security detail. And she was great. She loved Morris. She knew Morris for many years. And we had a standing room only crowd on the rooftop of the new building at Hollywood Forever. And she looked out and she said, "You could bring out all these people 23 years after you're dead. That's pretty good. That's saying something."
It really is. It really is. Well, thank you, Marianne. I'm so grateful for your time. And please, everybody, please buy the book and stay tuned for the documentary, which hopefully will be coming soon. Maybe a movie one day. Maybe a movie.
Oh, yes, there will be. Yeah, there's something in development now. So.
Oh, cool. Very cool. I can't wait. I'm excited. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Duke. It was a pleasure.